Hello, my little demons. Today we'll be recording the third entry in our Reedsy horror story series. So far, you all seem to enjoy these, so I will continue uploading them. If you have any entries of your own, or any suggestions, please let me know in the comments below, or by emailing me. We have 3 stories to present today. I hope that you enjoy them as much as I did. First story. The first story is a bit odd in that the author sent me a revised copy of the story. The one listed in the description is still the same story, but you might notice some differences from the one that I'm reading. Thank you for understanding. The title of this story is Stranger with a Familiar Face by Travis Hall, posted June 5th, 2021. We cannot let our past define who we are. I know that you, as you are reading this, are thinking of at least one mistake that you wish you could go back and change. The truth is, you cannot. You cannot make up for it. You cannot make amends. All you can do is look to the future and be the person today that you wanted to be then. If we let the past haunt us, it will live with us and suffocate any possible future. Preston was guilty of this. If he would have let his demons lie in the past, his future would have been promising. For him, it all began and ended with a gradual knock at his front door. If Preston would have known that he was letting in the resurrection of his past, he would have never opened the door to his home. He would have stayed in bed and remained content with the persistent noise. Preston moved out of his mother and stepfather's house when he turned 18. Ever since his dad passed away, it had become more than a broken home. The stench of alcohol polluted the air instead of the smell of sawdust. Instead of TV droning on in the background, he could hear his stepfather screaming at his mother and younger brother for whatever reason he could think of. Preston knew that his mother had chosen her own fate, but his 12-year-old brother Lyle had no choice. As soon as he could, Preston would return for him. Preston was an intelligent young man who had made a decent living for himself early in life. He learned the stock markets at a young age thanks to his uncle. His tenacity was driven by someday providing a better life for him and his brother. Preston's tenacity and purpose, matched with the intelligence, created an unstoppable force. Preston also invested as soon as he was able. The drive for success consumed him. In 4 years, he had turned $5,000 into $500,000. This was not his passion, though. Preston's passion was farming, just like his bereaved father. At age 22, he withdrew all his money and bought his dream farm in Plateau, Missouri. The property had 230 acres and a beautiful 2-story house. Preston spent a couple of months mending fences, building pens, and proper shelter. He bought a steer to butcher and some chickens and a couple of roosters. He purchased a couple of rams and 26 sheep. Half of the sheep he bought were already pregnant. Preston put the animals there first and moved in a couple of weeks later. The first strange occurrence happened Preston's first night sleeping inside his new home. He laid awake, staring at the ceiling. He could hear a soft patter of rain outside while thunder rumbled in the distance. While living in Springfield, Missouri, he had a playlist that he would use to drown out the outside world. It always put him to sleep so easily then. But tonight, the sounds beckoned restlessness and curiosity. Preston. A sharp, barely audible whisper called out to him. Preston jolted upright in his bed. Hello? He whispered. Preston laid back down and put his mind at ease, reminding himself that it was an old house and that he was not used to the quiet yet. In an apartment, hearing voices on a regular basis was quite normal. A solitary mind's imagination can tend to run wild. Preston! This time his name was said more concise. He sat up in his bed once again. This time he knew that someone said his name, someone familiar. Preston's heart beat a little faster. Hello? Preston heard a knock at his front door. Knock, knock, knock. Knock, knock, knock. Preston threw off his covers and rushed downstairs. He stepped to his kitchen window and peered through the blinds to his front door. There was nobody there. Preston rubbed his eyes and looked again. Still nobody. Preston chalked it up to his imagination and went back upstairs to fall asleep. The next morning, Preston woke up feeling unrested. He still had responsibilities, though. It was time to get up and take care of his animals. Preston took his ATV and drove around the place to check his fences. It was a good thing he did. The rain had softened the ground enough to fall a tree over his fence. As he was cutting the tree out, Preston noticed a sheep standing close by, staring at him. "Hey there, girl." The sheep stood there blankly. Whenever Preston finished cutting the tree out and started to fix the fence, he noticed that the sheep had not moved from her original spot. "You're a creepy sheep, aren't you?" Preston walked up to her and pet her on the top of her head. "Go away now, creepy sheep." Preston continued to work. While he was putting in his last fence tie, he heard, "You could have saved me." Preston's first instinct was to turn around and look at the sheep. She had gotten down on her knees and was about to deliver. Preston would have left her alone, but he could tell she was having trouble. He assisted the best that he could and got the lamb out, but it was stillborn. As soon as the lamb was birthed, the mother rolled her eyes into the back of her head and passed away. Disappointed that this was the first birth on his new place, Preston threw the sheep and the lamb in the creek so the crawfish could eat them. In the following weeks, Preston barely slept. He lost 12 lambs and their moms, half of his chickens, and his steer. The stress of the losses caused some of his sleeplessness. The true cause was as he tried to sleep, he would hear that knock at his front door. Every time he looked through his kitchen window, no matter how fast he ran, he saw nothing. He thought he was going insane. Preston finally thought of a conclusion that his gut told him was the wrong one, but at this point, his only option. It was a quiet night, so quiet he could hear the mild ringing in his left ear from when his stepdad slammed him across the head as a child. This was strange, since in the summer you could usually hear the spring peepers or coyotes howling in the distance. Preston was thinking of this when he once again heard the knock at his front door. Knock, knock, knock. Knock, knock, knock. Preston flew down the stairs, skipping most of them until he reached the bottom. When he walked off the last step, Preston felt lethargic, like he was trudging knee-deep in mud. Like something knew the solution he had thought of for his problem. Preston paused halfway to the door and put his hands on his knees to catch his breath. "Stop," a voice whispered. It was the same voice that called out his name the first night he had spent in the house. "Who is it?" Preston replied. "Who's here?" "Stop." The voice echoed repeatedly around the house. It grew louder and louder until it finally screamed, "Stop!" Then the voice was hushed by the knock at the front door. Knock, knock, knock. Knock, knock, knock. Preston made his way to the door. He put his hand on the knob, and it was warm to the touch. The longer he held on, the hotter it became. He could not let go, not until he turned it and opened the door. Deep down, he knew this would be the only way the knocking would stop, whether it was because of the immense heat that started to sear his skin or his unaltered curiosity. He opened the door. When he did, he saw his brother stand just beyond the threshold, beaten to barely recognizable. "Lyle?" Preston swung the door open and invited his little brother in. "What are you doing here? What the hell happened to you?" Lyle did not reply. Lyle was too young to drive. Preston wondered how he walked an hour and a half drive. How did he get beaten so badly? Lyle would not answer. He must have been in shock. There was only one person that could possibly know the answer to his questions. Preston ran upstairs and called his mom. Hey, Mom? Who is this? His mom answered, half asleep. Preston forgot it had been a couple of years since he talked to her. It's Preston. Oh, hey, Preston. What's up? Lyle's here, and he looks like someone beat him half to death. There was a silent pause on the other side of the phone. Mom? Preston, that's not funny. Lyle was beaten to death 2 years ago by that piece of shit that called himself your stepdad. She hung up. It all started rushing back to Preston, the funeral, the arguments with his mom, the sleepless nights, riddled with guilt for not saving his brother soon enough. Then he turned to the apparition. Who are you? The apparition smiled and said, You could have saved him. Preston was found the next day. A neighbor spotted him in a field close to the road. The neighbor walked up to the fence and immediately called an ambulance to at least pick up the body. There was no saving Preston. Not while the remaining sheep were devouring the last bit of meat on Preston's bones. Second story. The title of the story is The Firefly Fairy by A.G. Scott, posted June 13th, 2021. Small disclaimer before we start the story. The characters use accents that I am not familiar with, so I will be trying my best. To the untrained eye, the Cartwright farm seemed a nice enough place, peaceful if a bit isolated. But looking closer over Ma Cartwright's neatly cultivated garden past old Nana Cartwright in her rocking chair on the porch, one would notice something unnerving. Not only did the siding peel, lending the house a general air of long-going decay, not only were the windows covered in rows of thick oak planks, but the Cartwrights themselves carried a mangy, wild countenance, untrained by polite society. Little Grayson Cartwright, barely 10, wondered whether the windows were boarded up to keep danger out or to keep him in. In his short time on Earth, he had never once been allowed to set foot beyond the property line, and so, despite never knowing anything else, he recognized and more despised the backwater bent of his family tree. Not one unrelated soul had come to see the farm in generations, and for decades now, the only occasions on which anyone would leave were Pa's trips east to sell fruits of the harvest or Ma's infrequent forays into town. And so, since boyhood, Grayson's lone escape came in the form of the books his mother brought back for him. In books, he could see every part of the world he ever wished to. This was, of course, a stopgap at most. Each week he saved his quarters from the Firefly Fairy so that one day, when he came of age, he might travel the world. One particular summer evening, he thumbed through his copy of Journey to the Center of the Earth. The pages were yellowed and dog-eared, and margins filled with tentative plans for a journey of his very own. A call came from the kitchen in Nana's unmistakable, drawly croak. "Come on, youngins, run on and get you some flies afore it gets truly dark." Dusk already. With a forceful sigh, Grayson hopped up and stashed his book beneath his pillow, then made his way to the front of the house. Nana stood smiling in the open doorway, waving Grayson and his 2 older brothers out into the yard. "Go on, hop to it," she added. "Oh, Nana," said Grayson, "my guts are all twisted. I'm really not feeling well. Can I skip out just this once? Nana pursed her wrinkled lips and delivered a firm slap on Grayson's neck. You better stop trying to lie to me, boy, she said. I got eyes on the back of my head. Now, get to work. Miss one day, that fairy'll get real ticked off and never come again. Grayson nodded and dragged his feet behind his two brothers, Junior and Jackson, perplexed as usual by the senseless nature of the Cartwright family rituals. The trio carried nets as if they were loaded guns, walking the yard like poachers, head on a swivel. A firefly floated by. Jackson, the middle child, sprang forward, trapped the bug in his net, and quickly crushed it between his fingers. He then jogged over to a small stone in the grass, lifted it slightly, and placed the little dead thing underneath. In about 12 hours' time, there would be a quarter in its place, same as it happened every morning. Nana would again insist that this was the work of the Firefly Fairy, and Grayson would continue to pretend that he didn't know the truth. The brothers carried on in the waning light, trapping and killing the fireflies as quickly as they glowed. Seeing the carnage, Grayson couldn't hold his tongue any longer. This ain't normal, you know. Junior chuckled. What ain't? The damn firefly hunts, said Grayson. I've read my fair share of books. What takes place down here south of the Mason-Dixon, not one of 'em mentions anything like this. It's strange. Sure it's strange, said Junior. But don't fuss. Nana's poor heart'll up and give out. Anyway, it's tradition. It ain't natural, and you're forced to do it. Far as I can tell, that's just what traditions are. So get used to it. But where did it come from? What did Paul tell you? Some bullshit. He said fireflies bring birds, and birds bring snakes and foxes bring wolves who will eat little kids. But I know that ain't true, because I read there ain't a single wolf in all South Carolina. Now come on. I'm 10 years old. I'm basically a man. Ain't I old enough to know by now? Junior and Jackson stopped and turned around, their faces grim. Grayson stopped short and looked up at them, determination in his eyes. Junior sighed. Oh, all right, Grayson. I'll tell you. Let me think. I'm sure you know this land used to belong to the Indians. You don't see any around here now, do you? Well, that's because when the settlers came through these woods, they burned just about everything in their way, leather, teepees, bodies, and when they were done, they took whatever was left and buried it right underneath our feet, then carried on out west. A few years later, our ancestors happened upon this land and decided to set up shop. Here's where it gets nutty, kid. Our ancestors realized pretty quick that this place wasn't right, but all their money was sunk into making this their home, so they had nowhere else to go. They lived in fear and suffered here. What they didn't know, and what our great-grandpa Jim figured out, was that their problems had everything to do with them fireflies. See? Every night, the fireflies remind the native spirits that live here about that night the settlers burned their village, so our family figured best not to piss 'em off, and that's why we try to catch as many fireflies as we can. Grayson looked up at his brother Junior, eyes wide. Then he looked at Jackson, who seemed like he was holding back a laugh, and began to pout, which made Jackson burst. Oh, screw you, Jay. You're worse than Pa. No wonder don't nobody come by. We're a bunch of loons. Junior smirked and shrugged. As he walked away after a pair of fireflies, Jackson leaned in towards Grayson. Again, he put on a stone face. Scary as that little ghost story might have been, it ain't nothing compared to the truth. Truth is, we Cartwrights ain't like other families. We got secrets. Things we're better off with people not knowing. And with that, Grayson was thoroughly spooked, although he wouldn't show it. He rolled his eyes and walked away from Jackson in a huff, fulfilled his obligation to Nana, and started inside. "Getting pretty dark," he said. "I'm gonna head back." That night, Grayson lay awake, eyes tracing the grain of the planks nailed over his window. Though his body was heavy, his head spun with the implication of the evening's conversation. Was there really something wrong with his family? Wrong with this place? There wouldn't be any sleep this night, nor any light to read with, so he needed to occupy himself otherwise. He tiptoed through the pitch-dark hall, hands searching the walls and the emptiness before him. His fingers grazed a dull metal hook, apparently meant for holding lanterns, but it was a waste. After dusk, the Cartwright house was lightless. Pa always said lanterns were a waste of perfectly good oil and electric lights. Well, they were the devil's work. These were clumsier lies than the ones Grayson had learned to pick up on in his books, but they were repeated so often that they took on a ring of truth. As Grayson wove through the moon-cast shadows near the porch door, the old floorboards gave a bit beneath his bare feet. Out front, Nana snored softly in her rocking chair. This struck Grayson as odd, because Nana had the nicest bed in the house, and her chair seemed uncomfortable, almost skeletal. Perhaps she had just finished ferry duty and decided to sit down for a rest. More unnerving was the scene in the yard. Hours had passed since sunset, but Ma, Pa, and Junior were all spread out in the grass, nets in hand. Were they really still at it? Did they ever sleep? What weren't they telling? Grayson's confusion turned to rage. If they can keep things from me, I can keep things from them. He padded off into the forest, fully intending to run away and never come back. He didn't have his books, or even his quarters, but with each springy step, he felt more sure he could make do. Half his young life had been spent preparing to get away. But when Grayson reached the property line, something gave him a pause. He slowed to a walk and felt it, a feeling like a million eyes watching from the darkness in the trees above. The earth beneath his feet crunched and shifted. He knelt down to get a closer look and realized what the dim moonlight had failed to show him. The substance underfoot was not black topsoil, but thousands upon thousands of dead and decaying fireflies. And from the pile of discarded carcasses emerged a single faint light. Returning to the house, Grayson was relieved to find the yard was empty. Still, he kept quiet as he walked up to the porch, and a calloused hand enveloped Grayson's upper arm, squeezing and twisting until it stung. "Yow!" Grayson shouted. "Ungrateful little boy," seethed Pa, dragging Grayson up the porch steps. "What did I tell you about going out after dark? Next time, I promise you'll think twice about disobeying me under my own roof. Crack of dawn, you're going to work." Pa pulled open the door, and as easily as he baled hay, tossed Grayson into the house. The boy scrambled to his feet and jogged to his bedroom, chin tucked, to hide his tears even in the dark. And when his door was shut, he opened his hand. The young firefly sitting in his palm flickered to life. An idea struck. Grayson quickly emptied his quarter jar onto his dresser and then placed the fireflies inside. Screwing on the lid, he watched as the firefly's light grew brighter and brighter still until it stained the glass. Now he had a lantern of his own. More importantly, he had a light by which to read after dark. Buzzing with excitement, he pulled Journey to the center of the earth from under his pillow, and all through the night he drifted away to a bigger, better world. Retribution was swift and merciless. From the time the cock crowed in the evening's firefly hunt, Pa Cartwright worked Grayson like a mule. Weed pulling in the morning made knots in the boy's back. Dead tree removal in the sunny midday brought scrapes and bug bites and sunburns. All day, Pa watched like a hawk, quick to interrupt a moment of rest or contemplation. Even when all the conceivable yard work was done and Grayson tasted freedom, there was more to do. For dinner, he made stew over an open flame and was not allowed so much as a bite. When dark fell, Grayson was exhausted. All he wanted in the world was to withdraw from the family, climb in bed, and lose himself in a book. But it wasn't to be. The first thing that he noticed as he stumbled down the hall was a gentle thrumming noise emanating from behind his bedroom door. Not a cause for alarm in any other house, but on the Cartwright farm, totally out of place. There existed no electrical circuitry, no air conditioning, nothing that would immediately explain such a sound. The second thing he noticed, more alarming than the first, was a repetitive croaking, like someone spilling a bag of marbles and quickly scooping it up and doing it again. When he finally built up the courage to open the door, his heart dropped. The room was filled from floor to ceiling with hundreds of glowing fireflies. They swarmed like locusts, crashing headlong into the walls. The walls would not budge, of course, but the planks covering the windows splintered as easily as a dead tree beneath an axe. They crashed and retreated again until the moonlight began to spill into the room. A glint of light caught in the broken jar on the floor, and Grayson was left to wonder how one ordinary firefly became so many. He stood slack-jawed and helpless in the doorway. The planks crumbled to bits and fell away. In one breath, a web of cracks shot across the surface of the dirty glass. In the next, the window shattered altogether, letting the vibrant clouds of fireflies out into the night. Grayson stumbled forward thoughtlessly. Ah! He stepped on a piece of the broken jar, slicing the pad of his foot from the ball to heel. There wasn't any time to sulk. Outside, there sounded a hollow, whooping shout like a wolf's howl or a native war cry. Through the empty window, he saw it. From the forest emerged a wall of mist, violently churning and spitting and crackling as it rolled forth. It bore down on the house slowly but inevitably, passing through Ma's garden, where the flora wilted and knelt, and the poor fireflies just escaped, flew straight into the death that awaited them in the mist. In one angry, hissing instant, their light was extinguished. Someone yelped, "Ah, hell!" Leaning out of his window, Grayson could barely catch a glimpse of his brother, Junior, who was leaping off the porch with a little pistol in his hand. Bumbling something quietly to himself, Junior made what looked like a sign of the cross, raised the pistol up at an angle, and pulled the trigger. Instead of a bullet, hot orange light shot from the end of the barrel, tracing an arc away from the house. Before it could get very far, spectrally tendrils rose from the mist and, in a whip-like motion, intercepted and smothered the flare. Junior quit his prayer and cursed, frantically trying to load another shot, doing anything he could to avert disaster, but it was too late. More tendrils slithered out from the body of the mist, and, like a gag, they wrapped themselves around Junior's face. Junior writhed and fought and stamped his feet, but with each passing second, the air was drained from his lungs. He fell limp on the porch steps, and the mist, or whatever it was, continued to advance. Grayson needed to find a way out. He climbed through the window and up 2 stories to the roof, where he stood just above the height of the mist. From there, he saw the terrible truth. The mist touched every inch of the property line and came from the forest in every direction, slowly encroaching upon the house, as if trying to choke the life out of the trespassing Cartwright farm for good. There was no escape, Grayson knew. As screams from inside the house pierced the still night air, he glanced down at his bloody footprints on the roof's crooked shingles and balled his trembling hands into a fist. He thought about saying a prayer like Junior, but he knew deep down that prayer was just another senseless family tradition, just another lie. Instead, as the mist began to claw for purchase on the worn facade of the Cartwright house, and all was evidently lost, he thought of Jules Verne, whose worlds had given him hope in the darkest of times. He closed his eyes and soothed himself with a passage until he believed every piece of it. While there is life, there is hope. I beg to assert that as long as a man's heart beats, as long as a man's flesh quivers, I do not allow that a being gifted with thought and will can allow himself to despair. But this was real life, and belief alone was not freedom, even for a boy with boundless imagination. Indeed, little Grayson was just beginning to believe in Verne's words when he took his very last breath. Third story. The title of this story is Dinner with the Madigans by Gunnar, a reoccurring author. Posted July 3rd, 2021. Could you see who's calling me, hun? The shade's going to fall if I let go of it right now, Ryan called from the living room. That's not how I want our first day in this house to go, I called back. I set down the plates that I was putting away in the cupboard and made my way over to the island. It was a selling point for me. I'd always wanted a big island like this in my kitchen, and I found it hard to contain my excitement when the realtor showed it to us on our first open house visit. I grabbed Ryan's phone. I don't recognize the number. I think it's our new area code, though. It might be the realtor. Just pick it up, I guess, Ryan said through a strained voice. I picked up the phone and said a casual, hello? A very warm voice responded from the other side of the phone. Is this Mr. Yates? This would be Miss Yates, I answered, a little offended that my voice didn't come off feminine enough to make this clear. Mr. Yates is busy currently. Who would this be? Ah, of course. Where are my manners? This is Mark Madigan from across the street. I froze for a moment. The Madigans, the family that the former house owner had warned us about before moving in. They'd heard disturbing rumors about the Madigans while living in town, but did not share these with us because they felt that they were just that, rumors. They had still made it a point to steer clear and said that the Madigans never bothered them at all. They had told us not to worry about it, but that as long as we left the Madigans alone, they would leave us alone as well. I guess that wasn't true. Oh, well, good afternoon, Mr. Madigan. Yeah, it's so nice to meet you. Well, over the phone, that is, I laughed. What can I help you with? Mark chuckled heartily before continuing. Actually, I was thinking that we could help you out. I know that you've only just moved into town, and I'm sure that your day will be filled with heavy lifting and other work of that sort. So, my wife and I thought that you might appreciate not having to cook a meal for yourselves. We'd love to have you over for dinner, if you'd like to come. My thoughts immediately harkened back to what the previous homeowner had told us about the Madigans. They had never even met the Madigans, though. They hadn't even given them a chance. Mark seemed very nice. The people who made up those bad rumors about the Madigans must have never taken the time to talk to Mark. I figured that because no one really saw them out of the house, previous homeowners had included this in their description of them, the kids must have made up some stories just to spook the others with. That's very kind of you, Mr. Madigan. Thank you so much for the offer. We'd love to join you for dinner, I responded. I don't know, Violet. You heard what the last people who lived here said about them. Ryan spoke through his raised arms. His eyes were intently focused on the screw holes of the window shade. They never even talked to the Madigans, I said a little too loudly, making the rod for the shade drop a little as I held it. How could they know who they are if no one has ever really conversed with them? They just sound like nice older people who are trying to make some new friends. Come on, it's just one dinner. Ryan sighed and looked down towards the floor. He paused for a moment before nodding his head to the side as if he had just made a good point in his head. He sighed. Fine, just because I know neither of us are going to want to cook tonight. You've got that right, I said, planting a kiss on his lips, causing the shade to fall again. Welcome. It's so nice to meet the both of you. Please, please, do come in. Mr. Madigan looked to be around 50 years old. Older than us for sure, but definitely not old. He had a bulky build. He was probably a football player in high school. Maybe even in college, I thought. He had a kind face with aging lines beginning to show. His black hair had streaks of gray beginning to show as well. Ryan and I stepped into the house and brought in the atmosphere. The interior felt cozy. The deep red furniture and accents through the visible portion of the house only served to add to this. They made their way forward into the center of the house, passing through the living room. The deep red aesthetic seemed to continue through the house. In this room, there were 2 deer mounts. I found this peculiar. See, Mr. Madigan didn't seem like the type to hunt. He was too kind. I couldn't see him hurting animals. We continued onward, finding ourselves in the dining room. Mr. Madigan pointed us towards the dining room table and told us to take a seat and get comfy. He sat down across the table from where we took our seats. So, what brings you guys here? I could imagine that this little old town wasn't one of the first that popped up in your home-searching process. Mr. Madigan smiled. Ryan and I both laughed. He responded, Well, I actually got a job around here at the local college. This house was pretty close, so it worked out well for us. He put his arm around me and smiled. Well, I am so happy to hear that. He paused, his gaze fixing on the spot behind us. Oh, and look here, the lovely Lady Madigan herself. Oh, stop it, Miss Madigan chuckled flirtingly. She looked to be roughly the same age as her husband, possibly younger. She had gorgeous brunette hair that was styled in an out-of-date fashion, but that didn't detract from her vibrancy of her hair. Her smile looked genuine, but I noticed that she didn't smile with her whole face. Her eyes didn't shrink a little when she smiled. The expression on her eyes seemed to stay the same. She came and joined the group at the dining table, taking a seat next to her husband. They met each other with a smile, and Mr. Madigan put his arms around her, pulling her in and kissing her forehead. She smiled. They looked genuinely happy together. In my mind, I crossed domestic violence off the list of possibilities as to what the rumors could be about. Miss Madigan leaned forward in her seat and introduced herself. She asked us for our names and how we met. I was about to speak up, but Ryan spoke first. He'd been doing this fairly often lately, trying to convince me that he's just as social as I am. I teased him about his tendency to let me answer the questions addressed to the both of us, and he took that as a challenge. He was never mad about it. He genuinely seemed to enjoy taking the lead now, and he teased me about his answering questions first. Little brat. While Ryan was explaining the story of how we met, my eyes glanced towards Mr. Madigan. I did a subtle double take. His eyes were wide and unseeing, his eyebrows slightly angled downward. His head was facing towards Ryan, but it didn't look as though he was looking at him. It was more like he was looking through Ryan. His mouth was slightly open. He looked completely devoid of life, like he was in a trance of some sort. I made a point not to make my observing too obvious. His stare continued for what felt like a very, very long time. My attention was redirected when Miss Madigan sat up and said, Well, I guess I should finish up supper so that we can get to eating. Mr. Madigan's stare was broken, and he snapped right back into the man that I had seen at first. He smiled and rubbed his hands together in anticipation. "Excuse me," I said to Mr. Madigan. "Where might your bathroom be?" "Oh, I should have pointed that out before we sat down. Silly me. My apologies. It should be down the hall, on the left," he answered, pointing off toward my left. He added, "Oh, just don't go into the door at the end of the hallway. It's a rather private room." I got up and tugged at my dress a little, making sure that it wasn't bunched up. "Thank you," I said with a smile. I made my way into the hallway as Miss Madigan went to the kitchen. I observed the hallway as I walked toward the bathroom. They had some immaculate taste in art. I'm not familiar with art to the point where I can point out who each painting was done by, but I can appreciate beautiful artwork when I see it. Art depicting landscapes of serene waves of grain, mountain ranges, and more. My eyes caught something set on the top of one of the dressers in the hall. A skull. I got closer and observed it in awe. It was pristinely kept and very lightly colored, unlike the slightly brown tint that I've seen in the movies. The process that someone must have gone through in order to keep the skull intact and this clean had to have been very articulate. As I approached the skull, I realized that it was human. I wasn't sure what I initially thought it was, but the shape and size made it obvious now. That's strange, I thought. Who just keeps a human skull out on display like this? I released the thought from my mind for a moment and looked up again, intent on getting to the bathroom. There was another skull, this one on a separate dresser. I walked past it, my breaths shorter. A small chair set out separate from the table or desk, another skull on it. I peeked my head into a room to my right with the door ajar, 2 more skulls in that room. Okay, what the hell? I pushed on, finally finding the bathroom and shutting the door quickly behind me. I put both of my hands on the inside of the door and rested my head against it. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing. After I composed myself to some extent, I blew out another long breath and turned around. The bathroom seemed normal, no skulls. I found the toilet and walked toward it. As my head came up with the toilet lid, my eyes locked on the window shade. It was not traditional, I noticed that much immediately. Light seemed to be peeking through it, like it was translucent to some extent. There were darker patches, though, that almost looked like freckles. Reluctantly, I reached my hand out toward the shade. I had to know for sure. I grabbed it between my thumb and pointer finger. Thick, smooth. I snapped down and threw the toilet seat up too. I bent over and vomited. I moved my hand to get the hair out of my face and out of the line of fire. I vomited again. My breaths drew very short and quick. I got up and flushed the toilet, avoiding looking at the shade. I washed my hands in the sink and I bent down to wash out my mouth. Tears had formed in my eyes. I couldn't let it look as though I'd been crying, so I sat there, leaning against the sink and took a deep, deep breaths. In, out, in, out. Once the tears passed, I dabbed my eyes, careful not to smear my mascara. I turned towards the door. I have to tell Ryan. We have to get out of here. I think I know what the rumors are, and I think they're true. I entered the hallway and walked back towards the kitchen, careful to keep my composure. I passed the skulls, noticing in passing that the lampshades was most likely made out of human skin as well. I slowed my steps, making sure that I did not cause any alarm when I got back into the dining room. Oh my God! The door at the end of the hall. If this is what they're displaying out here, what could possibly be so private in that room? I finally reached the dining room. In the room, Ryan was alone at the table. I scurried over to him and sat in the seat I had been in before. I grabbed his arm and bent close to him. "Ryan, I think dinner time," Miss Madigan shouted as she emerged from the threshold to the kitchen. Mr. Madigan chimed in with a wide grin on his face. "Our specialty dish." chili, cooked with our own secret ingredient. Mr. Madigan gave a wink towards Ryan and I. The Madigans chuckled in unison. Thank you for watching, and I really hope that you enjoyed these stories today. If you did, please go to the description and give the authors a like on their page, as well as consider subscribing and liking the video as well. Recording and editing these takes a very long time, so I truly hope that you enjoy them. I tried a new editing style this time, so I would appreciate if you let me know what your thoughts of it are in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and have a good night.